So in the world of AI, generating a JavaScript code or debugging or even creating a feature using JavaScript is pretty much, you know, anyone can do it, right? But the problem with AI is it cannot really like code you what you really like. Okay, that's why it is important to still follow the best practices, the standard ones. Okay, so the first one is we need to know what const or let is, and you never use var. So var is an obsolete way of creating variables or declaring variable. Okay, so const means no reassignment. If your data is not reassignable, so you need to use const. Okay, so meaning once a variable is declared with const, you cannot reassign it, you cannot redeclare it, you cannot change the value. Okay, so it is best used for values that shouldn't change, like for example configurations, constants, name, those kind of data. Okay, and sometimes, I mean, most of the time, when you are referencing an object or an array, when you are declaring something like those, 99% of the time you will use const. Even though their contents is still can be mutated, you would still use const. Okay. There are times you will use let for objects and arrays, but most of the time, those are const. Okay. So let is block scope. Actually, even const is also block scope. Let is useful when you need a value to change. Like for example, their age, you need to increment their age, right? Each year. But for example, their birth year, that's const. But for the age, you use let. Okay. And let is useful for block scope. So meaning, like for example, when you want to get the current date or when you want to increment by date, so you need to declare the current date and you can use for loop to change the value of the current date to how many days you want to increment your current date. Okay, so that is block scope. So just remember, block scope is when you say block, it means those if statement, loops, while loop, for loop, even function. So meaning whatever variables are inside that block, you cannot call it outside that block. That's why it is block scope. Okay? So yeah, just completely ignore var or don't use var. This is also one of the mistakes that I did when I first learning JavaScript. I was confused back then. It was 5 years ago, and 5 years ago, there are still code that uses var as their declaration of variable. And I was confused back then. I didn't know what var is. I went to use const and let, but nowadays no one is using var anymore. So that's why, yeah, it is safe to completely ignore var and use const or let. So just remember, you can default to using const. I mean, when you declare a variable, just use const, okay? There are some time you use let, but not of the time. Most of the time you will use const. Just remember let if you reassign the value or you will change the value later. And if the value is not changing, just use const. Functions are for specific tasks, so you need to write them well, okay? So there's a principle called single responsibility principle, and this applies to a function because a function should do one thing, right? And it should do it really well, okay? You cannot be vague about your task with that function, so you need to make it well created. Your function need to just do one task. And yeah, this improves readability and testability. Okay, if that's a word. But yeah, it's easier to read it and also it's easier to test it. Okay, and also functions are for reusability. Okay, that's why you need to create it as concise as possible and you need to create it small, clean functions so that, it can be reused across different parts of your code base. So like for example, I have this function and this function has one task. Okay, it only does one task for me. So when I want to do something involving this function, so I can, call this whatever I want. Okay, this is also useful, guys, when you are transitioning from JavaScript to React. You will see a lot of function in React. React component itself is a function. Okay, that's why it is important for us to really understand function. avoid long and complicated functions, because the longer it is, the complicated it is, there's a chance that it is harder to debug or maintain. It is prone to bugs. Okay, so what you need to do during your refactor task, if you have a long and complicated function, break them into smaller pieces. Okay, so like for example, you see a function that is really, it's confusing, it's a confusing function, so you refactor it, you remove or you put the task that can be reused in a function, in a different function, so that you don't need to code it in your main function, you just call that function inside your function. Okay, so another thing is naming. Okay, naming convention. You need to name your function as descriptive as possible. But of course, you don't have to name it like the longest function that you could create. Just the balance side. Okay, just use descriptive names. Like for example, this function is for getting user by ID. Okay, so instead of calling this, let's say, process data or fetch data, so anyone reading your code knows what the function does. Okay, so even if it's not you, and most of the time it's not only you working on that project, right? So it is a best practice for us to, the function name alone, the developer has the idea of what that function does already, even if your function has no comments. Okay, speaking of comments, so yeah, that's also additional. If you can have your functions comments, so yeah, that's better. Okay, so async in JavaScript is kind of different, because JavaScript is async by nature. So unlike other programming languages, so JavaScript is async by nature. It does have some synchronous code, or you can do it synchronous, but it's not recommended because we are in the browser. JavaScript is in the browser. The reason why JavaScript is async by nature is, since we are dealing in browser, we are fetching data, we are querying onto the database, we are reading files, those stuff. Okay, that's why it is hard for us to make JavaScript synchronous, and it doesn't make sense. Okay, so it is asynchronous. And a browser, if there's no internet connection with the browser, it is nonsense, right? So a lot of things happening by API calls and fetching data. Okay, so the way we handle promises in JavaScript is by, we have two different ways of using promise here. So like we can use async keyword and await keyword for us to get the data, or we can use that then. Okay, so that then, for me, personally, personal opinion, so I just prefer using the async keyword and await keyword, because it kind of like a synchronous. I mean, at first glance, I think it's more readable because it is closer to synchronous code. Okay, so now, if you have a lot of promises, if you have a lot of async tasks, and they are independent with each other, so you can run them parallel, okay, for efficiency. Like if you are, let's say, for example, fetching blog posts, and also you are fetching the user, or I mean the author of that blog, so you can, parallel the calling of that promise. So yeah, it's just a better efficiency. Okay. And last thing here is you need to handle the errors. Okay, so always catch promises. Always use try and catch. So basically, it means that the code will try this code first before you can catch the error, right? When this try block is executed, so everything inside here, JavaScript will run this, and if it encounters any error, so it will proceed to the catch statement or block. Okay, so this is useful for you to get the errors, or for you to give the user, let's say, a better error message, right? So don't forget to use the try catch, because server can down sometimes, or there are a lot of things that might happen during the API calls. So yeah, just use that. So another thing is, remember the dry principle. So do not copy or paste. Instead, create a reusable function. Okay, so dry principle means don't repeat yourself. So if you find yourself like copying code, refactor it into reusable function or module. Okay, this is somewhat related to function. So do not copy paste code. Not only copy pasting from LLMs, ChatGPT, Stack Overflow, but also with your code. So yeah, create a reusable function for that. And the reason for that is because of maintainability. Like for example, there's a bug. If you copy or pasted a block of code, so when there's a bug with that code, you need to fix all of those bugs to the code that you copy pasted. Okay, so it is better if you just create a function, and if that function has a bug, if that block of code has a bug, if you fix that bug inside that function, all of those will be resolved. Okay, yeah, so that's for consistency. Okay, so just remember, yeah, refactor aggressively. So as your code grows, so extract repeated patterns into shared utilities or helper functions. Okay, so yeah, the last thing that I want to mention here is, because of the age of AI, a lot of things, a lot of the code actually was written by AI. So it is very important to consider security. So I think security is our number one priority nowadays. So in JavaScript, there's a eval method which is not recommended. It means that whatever your string, when you use it with eval, so it is transforming it into a script. So this is not secured because the string, especially if that string is your user input, so they can inject something there, it open doors for injection attacks. So yeah, just avoid those. And also the unsanitized inner HTML. The idea is a user can inject, especially if it is input to the DOM or document object model, which can cause, cross-site scripting, those kind of stuff. Okay. So yeah, remember, validate and sanitize your input. So it is better to sanitize them before inserting into our database, and also validate them both client and the server side. Okay. And yeah, there's also a keyword strict mode, which catches, those, there are silent errors in JavaScript. So it catches those silent errors. But when you are using ES6 or ECMAScript 6 import export, you don't really need to do this. Okay, because it is automatically like giving us this use strict keyword in our code. And a lot of frameworks nowadays are using ES6, like for example React. We are importing and exporting functions there. So yeah, we don't really need to do this. But yeah, this is just for awareness, I guess. So if we are using vanilla JavaScript, so this is, yeah, powerful. Okay. And then just be aware of your dependencies. So just limit those dependencies, those npm packages. No, just be aware. They can contain, vulnerabilities. The suggestion is keep them updated. Just audit them regularly. And then use HTTPS always. And last thing for the security is those secrets. Okay, so this is, I admit, this is also one of the things that I did when I first learning not only JavaScript but also other programming languages and coding in general. It's not protecting secret. Okay, so those secret, those are like the API keys, secret key, those kind of stuff which is personally yours. Okay, so do not hard code it on your code. Okay, yeah, use environment variables so that it's not really hard coded there. Okay, so environment variables are variables that inside your computer. It's not in the code, but on your computer, and you're just using those. And yeah, so since it's in your computer, so other user cannot really like see it, cannot really do anything about those because it's in your computer. So yeah, I think those are the best practices. Knowing this can have a bigger advantage for us. This can also be a preparation for us before jumping into React or other frameworks. So at least we must know this best practices, and some of the times coding is about writing clean code and also applying best practices, because as the app grows, also it is hard to maintain. That's why it is important to apply best practices.